Hey YouTube, let me show you my reloading bench. That's right, it's my kitchen table. And this little thing is my press. Wife has told me that I can't have any more space for my toys, so I need to make do with what I've got. And you may need to as well, so I'm going to show you how to reload in an apartment or a condo. Cue intro. Welcome back. Before we can get into the process of hand loading or reloading, we need to understand a little bit about ammunition. This is a schematic of a cartridge. On the right hand side we have the bullet or the projectile, and then we have the case, which typically is made of brass and is hollow. If we turn the case around and look at the end there, the head as it were, we see in the center of the head a round structure which is the primer. That's the part of the bullet that gets struck by the firing pin that causes the bullet to fire. And here's what we see is if we were to cut the case open, we can see that the case is hollow, and on that head end we see the blue brass part, and then there's a hole. And that hole is called the flash hole, and it allows the ignition from the primer being struck to light the gunpowder which lies within the case. The gunpowder ignites and burns quickly, creating pressure within the case, which fires the bullet off into the distance, but also has the effect of pressing all the way around on the case and bulging and expanding it out. And this is one of the things that we have to fix when we reload a cartridge. We need to squeeze it back into the proper shape so it will fit perfectly back in the breech of the gun when we try to fire it after reloading. Now that we know a bit about ammunition, let's take a look at the steps we're going to need to accomplish to reload a cartridge. Before we begin, we need to assemble all the tools and all the components that we need to put together our cartridges. And that begins with examining everything and make sure it's in good shape. If you've got brass that you picked up at the range, you really need to inspect it. In fact, you should be inspecting it through the whole process just to make sure there's no cracks in it and that it looks to be in good shape. The next thing to recognize is that there's more than one way to skin a cat. I'm going to tell you how I reload, but there may be variations in the way that other people do this, and they can be working just fine for them as well. The first task I accomplish is depriming the cases. Now, you may hear this called decapping. Present-day modern primers are really the evolution of percussion caps, which were used on earlier ammunition, and so it's not uncommon for them to be called caps, and thus the process of removing the primer called decapping. The reason why I choose to deprime first, because I want to wet tumble after I've decapped, and that way I can get cleaner primer pockets. The next thing we do is clean the cases, and cases are sometimes described as brass, so we need to clean those so that we get all the oils and grit and stuff off of them so we don't damage the tools that we use, the dies, as we're reshaping the brass and making it fit for reloading. Next, using our press, we push the case up into a resizing die that squeezes it back into the proper shape. If it's a rifle case, we definitely have to lube the case. If it's a small pistol case and we have carbide dies, we don't generally need to lube those. Next, we push them up into a die that expands the mouth of the case so we can just fit a bullet at the top of the mouth of the case. Next, we'll be putting a fresh primer into the primer pocket at the head of the case. There are lots of ways to do this and different tools, but we're going to be using a hand primer because I think it's easiest and fastest. Next, we carefully measure out a charge of powder and put that into the case. Next, we seat a bullet and push it into the proper depth inside the case. And finally, we crimp the case around the bottom of the bullet so that it stays relatively tight in position. Okay, let's look at these steps in greater detail. My press is a Buchanan precision machine. It's a great little device, came well packaged in a box, and I also got it with the optional carrying case. The bottom of the press is flat, so it fits smoothly on top of a table. The carriage has a place for a standard shell holder to be placed. I got my press with the lock and load adapters so that once I'd set a die, I wouldn't have to reset it for the same caliber. Because the way the handles are opposed to one another, you can clamp this down to the table with a simple C-clamp or a furniture clamp, have pretty good stability. I'm going to be using a single-purpose decapping die because I want to be able to clean out the primer pockets after I've decapped the shells. The capping pin sticks out of the bottom of the die as shown here, and it should stick out about 3/16 of an inch. As you're going to see, I'm going to screw it in to the press. It should be screwed down until it hits the top of the shell holder. Decapping is a simple process. You just slide the shell into the shell holder, push the handles together, and out pops the primer. The next step is to clean the cases to get them ready to be sized. Now, this is really kind of a religion amongst reloaders, so I'm really not going to get into detail here today. Suffice to say that some people simply brush off cases that they don't think look too dirty. Others scrub them super clean by throwing them into a rotating tumbler that has steel pins in it. So you do what you think is right for you. I'm going to tumble these shells. Now that our brass is clean, we'll be doing a number of steps to get it prepared to be shot again. The first thing we're going to look at is all the dies that we'll be using today. We have the resizing die, which will push the case back into the proper shape. We've already used the universal decapping die to remove the primers. We have an expanding die that will open up the mouth of the case to just receive the bottom of the bullet. Then we'll seat that bullet with the seating die. Today we'll also be using the crimping die to put a small crimp on our 9mm cartridge. The 9mm dies from Lee, which we are using today, come with great instructions, so just follow along with them. They also include a host of loading data that you might find useful as well. So let's set up our sizing die into the press. We're going to mount it on top and screw it down till it just contacts the shell holder when it's fully raised up. Then we'll tighten it down. We'll place a shell onto the plate and then press it up into the die and then pull it back down, and we have a sized case. Next task is to expand the mouth of the shells. You put the expander die on till it just touches the top of the shell holder, and then you back it off one full turn. Then you adjust the amount of flare that you want by advancing the die inward to increase the flare, or screw it out a little bit to decrease the amount of flare. You'll test it with the bullet, see if you can relatively easily seat it in the mouth, and if not, readjust it. Priming is very straightforward. You open the case, dump the primers in, shake them till they're all up right side up. Load it into the priming tool. Load the shell into the shell holder, Squeeze the trigger to seat the primer moderately firmly, and you're all done. Just check and make sure it's below the surface. I believe a loading manual is essential to safe reloading. You need a good source of data for choosing a charge and for setting the bullet. I recommend one of the books from Hornady or Lee or whatever you particularly prefer that gives you good information on different bullets, different powders, the charge quantity, and the positioning of the bullet for the cartridge overall length. Once I've chosen my recipe, I create a cheat sheet so that I can refer to it any time during the rest of the loading process. And the next thing we do is we measure out the powder. I use an electronic scale, but you can also use a balance beam if you prefer. And because I'm doing such a few number of shells today, I'm going to do them individually. I do have a powder throw that I use if I'm doing a large number. You carefully measure out the quantity of powder that you need. I'm using a Lee scoop here, but you can use a spoon or whatever you want. When you get it right, then use the funnel to transfer the measure into each of the cases one by one. Seating the bullet comes next. You take the bullet seating die and screw it in till it hits the top of the raised shell holder. And then you back it off 3 turns. Then you go ahead and tighten down the locking nut. After the die is seated, I take a sample cartridge, one that I've adjusted to be the correct length, place it into the press, and then I slowly lower down the seating adjustment in the center of the die until it just hits the top of the bullet. So then it should be just about perfect, although I'll adjust it by looking at measurements on each of the bullets that I initially do. I place a charged cartridge onto the press. I place a bullet into the expanded mouth, and then I go ahead and raise the press up to seat the bullet. Then we check the length with the calipers and decide whether we need to make any adjustments to our seating depth. It's important to remember that seating depth may control pressure that builds up inside the cartridge as the gunpowder explodes. So you want to make sure you follow those minimum cartridge overall lengths. When you're happy with your cartridge lengths, you go ahead and seat the rest of the bullets, checking every so often to make sure that your measurements are good. And then it's on to the crimp. Crimping is the last step in our manufacture of 9mm rounds. We're using the Lee Carbide factory crimp die. We screw it in until it just touches the shell holder, then back out the adjusting screw. We then load a round in and push it up into the die, and we turn down the adjusting screw until it just touches the case mouth. Then we move the cartridge out of the die slightly, and we screw the adjusting screw in 1/2 turn for a light crimp and 1 full turn if you want a heavy crimp. We're just going to do a light crimp here. And then you just crimp all the ammunition. That's it for today. We just made 9mm ammunition at the kitchen table. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe and comment below. There's enough interest. I'll go through each of these steps in greater detail, talk a little bit about equipment that might be useful for the limited space reloader, and have some greater conversation on other types of ammunition. Cue exit.